So I'm going to tell you about my research, but I'm also going to tell you why I'm sort of going to defend the subtitle of my book. So my book is The Volunteers, but the subtitle is, and it was with no shortage of back and forth that we came to this subtitle, How Halifax Women Won the Second World War. But for me to convince you that that is in fact admittedly provocative, but also true, I need to tell you what Halifax was like during the war. And so I'm going to go back to a historian who I quote in the book, Jay White. He's a Second World War historian. And Jay White said by 1940, so remember the war is starting in September 1939. By 1940, he calls Halifax was faced with a blitzkrieg of people. And he says that it was besieged from within and without. And by 1941, so barely into the war, a federal government memo that I found, I spent a week at Library and Archives Canada digging through boxes and boxes of stuff. It was great, I love it there, but you know, it's like onion skin. I found a government memo from January 1941 that said, Halifax is, quote, essentially a war zone. And so think about that. I'm going to just give you a little short reading from the beginning of the book, chapter 1, which sort of gives you a picture of this. Okay. The statement, it's way more than you're imagining, is the underlying flavor of the war in Halifax, of this book itself. When I tell you something happened a lot, or there were many, and you think you've got it, you can rest assured that unless you were there, you do not. The city was so desperately overwhelmed with service members, war workers, and all their sundry family members that wartime administrator of Atlantic Canadian Ports, E.L. Cousins, signed an order in council in November 1943 warning the citizens of Canada, so everybody in Canada, to avoid travel to Halifax or its sister city, Dartmouth. In the too little, too late fashion of the federal approach to Halifax's well-being during the war, the order was non-enforceable. Halifax by 1943 was underwater. Cousins' sternly worded statute was not going to turn off the taps, let alone drain the bath. In 1939, the Halifax Dartmouth City Directories, published by Mike Directories Atlantic Limited, listed 61 restaurants and lunchrooms in the city. That number shot up by 20 the next year and had doubled by 1944. These eating establishments range from Barrington Street's beloved Green Lantern, with its lunch counter, vinyl booths, and 15-cent marshmallow sundaes, to the honestly named, this is my favorite, I dug up in the research, hot dog stand, 109 Almond. There could have been 100 hot dog stands serving day and night. It wouldn't have been enough to feed the influx of visitors. They stayed in hostels, in the handful of hotels, and in curtain-off areas of people's homes. Halifax's population exploded from a little more than 68,000 at the war's start to 76,000 1 year later. That almost 12% jump must have felt extreme, but it was nothing compared to what came after. By 1944, there were 107,000 people in Halifax, a 61% increase. Imagine every 4-person household in your apartment building or condo becoming 6. But that wasn't the extent of the crush. The official numbers mostly didn't capture the countless transient folks. Service members, plus their wives and girlfriends and mothers and children who were staying in the city temporarily while their partners and parents were waiting to be deployed. There are other numbers that lend perspective to the impact of the war and the response the city mustered, though their sheer scale almost fails sense. The Central Magazine Exchange, a volunteer depot for the collection, packaging, and distribution of reading materials for troops to consume during long hours at sea or on watch. Oh, I hate it when I look at somebody and I'm like, hey, there's that person, I lose my spot. There we go. I'm back. I'll get you for this, Mark Wilson. Oversaw the doling out of 4 million magazines within the first 3 years of the war alone. More than 30,000 magazines every week from the war's start through June 1942. In 2 years, the North End Services Canteen served 400,000 hot meals to service members. That is 550 meals a day, every day of the year without respite. But numbers pale. Sometimes during the war, Haligonians would turn on their water taps and dribbles would come out. That's how many others were calling on the system. I think I'll stop there. No, I'm gonna stop there, okay. So Halifax was quite unique during the war. And it was unique because it was the launching point for the Canadian war effort. Every service member shipped out through Halifax. There were 500,000 service members that shipped out. It's important to remember that if you were Army or you were Air Force, you might be shipped out and you were gone for quite a while. Naval personnel would come in and go out, and come in and go out. They were here all the time. So it was a big crush of people. So there was this instant expansion of the city, and I think it's such an interesting time right now to launch this book because we're dealing with this housing crisis in the city. And you know, everybody's really keenly aware of space and where are people gonna live, and we're aiming now to increase our population, but we're also feeling this crush. The crush that existed then was, I can't say, you know, definitely it was 10 times as much, but it was worse. It was worse. And really nothing was done about it, which is part of the problem of the book. The federal government had told Halifax it was going to be the launching point. Halifax didn't ask for this. It just said, okay, this is where everybody's going through. And Halifax had to cope. Halifax was incredibly small at this time. So milk came by horse-drawn wagon at this time. There were no traffic lights in the city. They put one in during the war in Armdale, which makes no sense, but anyway. There were 55 kilometers of paved roads, which didn't actually matter that much because there were fewer than 6,000 private vehicles. Everybody traveled by tram or burning car. Some of you may have seen these burning cars that existed. Before the war, they carried they had about 9 million rides a year. Within a year of the war starting, that number shot up to 31 million rides per year in the tram system. I mean, it was overwhelming. So that expansion happened, but the federal government, unfortunately, concerned itself with only 3 things. Money, making sure it had enough money to fight the war. Battle readiness, so getting ships and ammunition, building stuff, and battle. And there were a few times that Halifax sort of, I sort of imagine it as like the municipal officials are like, help, and the feds were like, sorry, no. There just really was no help. Which I had heard and I understood, but then when I went through all of those boxes of memo of Library and Archives Canada, I was like, oh my God, they really, really just did not step up because they felt that this was a municipal problem they had created, but they didn't feel it was their responsibility to fix it. So the city begins to descend into a terrible, terrible situation. So there were 4 competing epidemics of measles, meningitis, scarlet fever, and diphtheria. And so it was so bad that Harvard sent a medical team to study Halifax, and one of the doctors reported that it was, this is a quote from a report, a hellhole of infection. It was not good here, not good. And this was all from overcrowding. And on any given night, there were 400 to 800 homeless service members. So we think a lot, I think a lot of us think a lot now about people who are experiencing homelessness in our city, and that ties into the housing crunch and all this, but imagine 400 to 800 service members with nowhere to sleep. And so they were just going into gyms, you know, it's like, okay, we're gonna open the gym, grab a piece of parquet flooring, right? It was wild. And still the federal government really didn't do much. When the federal government did step up, it kind of only did half a job. So I cataloged one episode in my book where they're like, they sent somebody to study the problem, and the person went back to Ottawa, and then a month later they had a meeting, and they're like, okay, I think we need a rec center. And this is all cataloged, like the minutes are there. You can just read through, and it's so painful. And they just ended up, I think, it was 8 months later, they finally got a recreation center, but there was no accommodations provided. So they moved at this glacial pace. So all of this sort of paints a picture that allows you to see the value that women provided in Halifax. Because the women moved really fast, really, really fast. and they did not study the problems that were in front of them because they were on their doorsteps and on their sidewalks and on their streets, and they just acted. And the most powerful kind of, the way I see it, I mean, there were kind of two kinds of ways to volunteer. One was with like a big organization like the Red Cross or the St. John's Ambulance, but most of the volunteers were just, the way I put it to people is always like me saying, hey, Ange, like, can you come over on Sunday and we're gonna make dinner for 10 people every Sunday for the next 6 years? And it was just, you know, it was very much like women just kind of banding together informally and taking on this work that they needed to take on because the city was suffering so badly.